I just had them calling me,
You guys ready?
cracking it open. It's just the state.
All right, let's do
They
it.
give us a minute. Thank you, Tricia.
At this time, we'll call the October 21st, 2024 Planning Board meeting to order. We have quorum, so if everybody will please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we'll move into our agenda. Item 2A, approval of the meeting minutes from the September 16th, 2024 Planning Board meeting. Purpose of this agenda is to consider approval of the meeting minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review? And if so, is there any comments, questions, or concerns? If not, I will entertain a motion.
Move they be approved as written. Second.
Got a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. All right, we'll move into our public hearing section. Public hearings are a time for petitioners to present requests and for the public to state their concerns and voice opinions in favor of or in opposition of these requests. If you intend to speak, please make sure that you have signed in on the public hearing sign-in sheet at the podium. Please clearly state your name, address, and whether you are for or against the request for the record. Please limit your comments to only 3 minutes in order for all that wish to speak to be heard in a timely manner. This time we will go to public hearing item 4A, Town Code Amendment, Town of Fuquay-Varina Land Development Ordinance Amendment Number 28, CTA 2024-03. Further information provided by staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Board. I am submitting the agenda abstract and supporting documents into the official record of the town. First item before you tonight is CTA 2024-03. It is a text amendment to the Land Development Ordinance requested by town staff. I'm going to give you a highlights reel, but there's a lot in this amendment, so if there's questions, I'm happy to go over anything you guys have. The bulk of this amendment is correcting terminology and updating standards as it pertains to the Comprehensive Transportation Plan and the town standard specification and construction details updates. For example, the term thoroughfare, unless referring specifically to a thoroughfare, has been changed to street, as that term is more appropriate. Additionally, the document name Community Transportation Plan has been updated throughout to become the Comprehensive Transportation Plan. Additionally, standards in the LDO have been updated to be consistent with the new recommendations of the CTP and the updates coming to the town specs. These updates were scoped as part of the CTP process, which we began about a year ago. A few other items being proposed for amendment are as follows. Updates to the allowances for beekeeping in the DJ, that's per a new general statute that was passed recently. A rewrite of the food truck section and the introduction of a new use, food truck campus. An allowance for residential amenity buildings to be exempted from certain commercial building massing standards to more resemble the residential areas in which they are located. Form-based streets have been removed from the LDO as the recommendations coming from the CTP update include enough flexibility for all street types and needs. A new buffer type called the type A+ buffer has been added as a buffer type and is intended to provide an increased visual barrier and privacy between large lot single-family developments and other development types. Tables and figures that have been outmoded by the CTP update have been removed from Appendix B. Again, that's just sort of a highlight reel. There's a lot else on there. We are happy to answer any questions. Town staff's recommendation for tonight is staff recommends approval of the proposed town code amendment. It is reasonable and in the best interest, public's best interest, as it improves upon the land development ordinance intent to modernize, provide sustainability, and allow for ease of use and enforcement concerning the town's current standards.
All right, anybody have any questions for staff before we open the public hearing?
I just have one. What's an amenity building?
An amenity, like a residential amenity building, so like the clubhouse or the pool house that would
Gotcha.
come with a residential subdivision.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions before we open the public hearing? All right, I guess at this time we will,
Thank you.
thanks Alyssa. We will open the public hearing. Eva, do we have anybody signed up?
We do not.
Shocker. All right. At this time, we will close the public hearing and bring it back to the board for further discussions and a motion. I know I have a couple of things to go over, but I figure I'd give everybody else a chance before I get into it. So does anybody else have any comments, concerns, questions, opinions?
I
Like-
have one. What is the difference in the daycare and the adult care when you speak of larger or large, what does that exactly mean?
Right, so the state has actually expanded their allowances for daycare, in-home daycares, basically to allow significantly more children. And so what we've done, two things. One, we are now wrapping adult daycare, which the state also regulates, in. So daycare across the board can be both for small children and adults. And then we are also realizing that 3 to 6, 3 adults, 6 children, really qualifies as a home occupation, and we're comfortable, as we're doing right now, of issuing a home occupation permit. Going beyond that, 6 adults or up to 12 children, that's a big ask for someone to be doing in a small house. Maybe that would be more appropriate for a larger house in the ETJ, right, that might have some parking and things like that. But that's a lot of dropping off and things. And so that's where we really felt it was more appropriate to do a special use permit, because that's a higher intensity use, and you really need to demonstrate that your house, your facility, your lot can handle that higher intensity use without really being a disturbance to your neighbors.
So is that adult care, is it the elderly, or is it
Yes.
the mentally incapacitated?
Right, it could be, that is adult
Physically
daycare, basically,
handicapped.
generally speaking to senior care.
Okay.
And we just didn't have any language in the code right now that dealt with that.
Was there any other regulation on those daycares slash adult cares there? Does the state do?
The state regulates them.
So they still need a license from the state, and they would be expected to do the actual inspections for, are you doing the right thing? And
Right, all the
right,
regulations,
do you
which
have
generally.
enough room for this? Obviously, we're concerned, similar to schools, we're concerned more about the impact to the community around
Exactly,
that business versus how the business is regulated.
right. So the state is regulating both the provider, right, making sure they have all their CPR and health and background checks and
Right,
fingerprints
yeah.
and all that, and the facility as well, for
Okay.
that appropriate use. We're just regulating the use of the property and whether that's appropriate.
I had a question kind of to that point. You know, we're taking out the copy of the approved application from DHHS. Is that just because it's kind of the process of how this goes through? I mean, I'm assuming DHHS is going to regulate them whether they're
Yes.
submitting it or not. I just didn't know.
Right, and they need, a lot of times too, they need our zoning permission before they can go,
Right.
so yeah, it's,
Okay, that's
of a
what I
chicken and
figured. It
egg
was
thing.
kind of a logistics thing. Is there somewhere, like, what's like the distinction between small and large? Is it like a square footage of the house?
no,
or
it's
is it-
the number of
Just-
children.
Just number, so it's the children, it's not the facility that is kind of regulated, it's the
Right,
the clients, they're sharing. Okay,
right.
gotcha.
So that would be, who regulates if there are 12 children in that house and they get on the bus and get off the bus? How is that regulated? I
Through the
mean,
state. The state is the
The
one who's
state.
going to be regulating the number of children and the licensing and the permissions. What we are just doing is relegating that if you are doing this in your home, you can watch up to 3 adults or 6 children on basically a home occupation permit, and that is compliant. If you're going to go, and again, you have to do all your regulations and permitting through the state
Right.
to determine what you're, and they will also be determining how many children, and, I mean, your license from the state will determine what your maximum allowed children or adults are in that facility.
Have you been getting lots of complaints from people like that'll notice that their neighbor is doing this and there's more children there than they probably should
Every
have or
once
can
in a while.
handle?
It's not a frequent complaint, but every once in
It
a
does
while. And
happen.
the state recently expanded. I think there is a huge need for childcare. And so coming out of COVID, the state really expanded what they allow to happen in a house. And so we're kind of keeping up with that on one hand, but also not letting it get out of control on the other hand.
Gotcha.
Right. For the bees, I had some questions. So taking out, I just know I've heard a lot of community members talking about bees and stuff like that. I don't know much about beekeeping, so I don't know really how the logistics and everything work, but taking out like some of the information on the prohibited bee operations and then complaint notice, just wasn't sure if like, you know, what's the process as far as like from a public policy standpoint of, you know, I know there's the new law and we're kind of switching it to standard beekeeping practices, but making sure that like the town has some ability to regulate whether or not, you know, if a home does have like some type of sickly ill bee population, or if there's a nuisance where, you know, the bees are swarming and it's affecting the neighbor. Is there some way that, you know, if we're taking that out, does the town still have kind of an arm to be able to fix those issues with residents?
Sure, and you are correct. The state came up with a new statute that basically everyone can have 5 hives. Period. Boom. And outside in the ETJ, there's no limit. So we are definitely mirroring the new state statutes on that. We had a lot of difficult to enforce or define language in there that we are cleaning up. We still have a general statement that they have to operate and keep that hive according to standard beekeeping practices. So if there's disease, if there's issues with swarms, that would still fall under our general nuisance categories.
Gotcha.
Speaking to both the Fuquay-Varina Police and Fire Department, they get very few calls or issues about beehives.
Right.
They get more calls, believe it or not, on like a swarm of hornets, right? And,
Yeah.
and that's an exterminator.
Right.
So, but it was also very difficult. We actually did get one complaint recently that Catty Corner lot had a beehive in the front yard. The woman also, the complainer, had a whole yard full of beautiful flower gardens.
Right.
And she got stung by a bee. Well, I mean, how do you even identify
Right.
if it was her bee or his bee or so I mean there was some tough language in there to enforce, and we even had language in there right now that it would be animal control would be called, and that is not the
goodness.
right responder to reflect. So again, this cleans it up, and I think it goes down to the basics that we can fall back on general beekeeping standards.
Gotcha.
And if there's an issue, then it still falls under. We have some very strong nuisance language in the Municode.
Cool. Thank you.
Anybody else have anything they got?
Sure, I do. Sorry, you go ahead.
Okay. Look, I've got a couple things. Like I really like these CTA memos. I think they're good and they do a good job. It's always hard though when there's so much information in so many different genres, because you're like, well, that I like, but this I don't like. And I can tell you one thing I didn't really like, and I don't even understand why we put it in there, was the orphan roads. And I was hoping that you guys could explain this one to me, because the way I read this, we're basically asking developers that to go in and improve roads, for roads that we're requiring them to connect to in an area that we brought into our ETJ. And there's just no way I can read this right. It makes any sense in my mind of to wrap my head around how we can do this, especially with all the CTA amendments we've been doing lately to try to kind of let properties that infill properties and be more developer friendly for these smaller type subdivisions. I mean, like, we've got provisions we've made here for 24 lots unless they don't have to do CTA improvements. And now we've got things where we're reducing the kiosk. And I think these are great things because they're small properties. But now we've got this blanket statement that if you tie to a stub street and it's an orphan street, you got to improve it all the way to the point at which it reaches the state maintained road. And that could be a long way. And I think what we're going to wind up doing is, one, I think we're putting an unfair burden on developers on something they can't control. And two, I think you're basically going to take some properties and make them undevelopable to no fault of anybody's own, except the fact that we put something in the ordinance that makes it undevelopable. I mean, we just did a subdivision, William Bluffs, that if it ties to 2 stub streets that are Wake County subdivisions, if it turns out those are orphaned, there's another 2,000 feet of street that have to be improved on 55 lots. And that's just one example, but I think there's several out there that would fall under that. So I guess I'm trying to understand where this came from, because this seems like something that we should be handling on case-by-case basis, either with developer agreements or with zoning conditions. So if you have a big subdivision that comes in and ties to a stub street and the neighbors complain, we just did one in Holly Springs, and the developer worked with those neighbors to improve some of the networking in that subdivision, but that was 237 lots. There's a lot more mass there to do some of that work, and you work with that homeowner association and use your neighborhood meeting process and your rezoning process to get there. So for me, this carte blanche statement that's in here that requires everybody to kind of go in there that's a tough one. I'm just kind of trying to figure out where the logic is for it.
Right, so our GIS maps have recently been updated to show these specific roads that we are not sure of whose maintenance they have. NCDOT roads are often built, they are dedicated as public right-of-way, and then DOT does not accept the roads for maintenance until after so many lots are built on that road. And there are some that they won't accept because there are even only a handful, there aren't enough lots on a road, and DOT won't accept them at all. So there's kind of this weird quandary, because we have subdivisions that were built, and for one reason or not, either NCDOT wasn't interested in accepting it at this time, or the developer didn't accept it. And then a new subdivision comes through that is using these roads for access. Now, some of these are often small subdivisions that were developed in the county at the time, and we are going to, and they are just living with what they have, right? They have small volumes of traffic on these roads, and that's just what it is. But now we're putting a subdivision that is tying into this and potentially putting a significant amount of traffic on these roads that are not being maintained, and will wear and tear these roads that the residents really have no say in. So this was something that was a priority communicated to us to come up with a solution for this. We went and identified them, and in general, these are small links in county subdivisions, and we felt that this was an important way to potentially help get rid of orphan roads when they are part of a development scheme. So
Yeah, I think there's got to be it's just my opinion. I just think there's got to be a better way.
This is a
than put it
fairly-
in here, because, like I said, there's just so many situations where you can get into a thing where basically you can render a property undevelopable because they can't figure out a way to get that orphan road up. Just because you find out that it's an orphan road doesn't mean you have the permission to go in there and improve that road. If they become, I don't know legally how long it takes for them to basically be used, and then now all of a sudden you have to get every property owner that lives in that subdivision to sign off on those improvements. And we all know that the number one complaint we get is connection to stub streets. So most people that live in those subdivisions aren't exactly going to be signing off on letting you do something in there when they don't want you to connect to it in the first place. So like, the way it reads is like essentially we're saying, all right, Mr. Developer, you have to connect to this road, which does make sense, right? We all agree to that. But you have to connect to it, and not only now do you have to connect to it, now you have to fix it of what's already existing all the way out to wherever it ends. And that's just going to come back to the bottom line. Ultimately, that's going to come back to hurting property values, because you're going to put that burden on that property that we brought into most of these. I've got to imagine in our ETJ now that we brought into the EGA a few years ago that we asked for. So it just, I don't know, something about that feels a little bit wrong. I understand the reason for trying to improve it and get to a remedy. I just don't know that this is the way to get there.
So this is a common solution that other municipalities and counties are using across the state. Wake County also has a program now that will basically give loans to neighborhoods, but that can be a lot for a small subdivision to pull together. So again, we did our research and we found that this is a solution that other municipalities are using. We felt this was a good solution to put in place. These are public right-of-ways, so these are not private streets. So as far as needing necessarily, there may be some situations where you need to do some modifications to swales or something that falls on the private land, but in general, these improvements should be happening within a public right-of-way, and you should not need all the residents' permission. But the other tool, obviously, we have is a fee in lieu. If there was something that was impossible about that, we still have that, the fee in lieu option for road improvements that could still hit this mark.
I've seen it too. I kind of appreciate your point about making it burdensome, but I've also seen from some of these subdivisions, there was one that I talked to probably a few months ago where they saw development coming in some adjacent land, and they see this traffic coming in, and they say, we've been here for so long and our road can't sustain this traffic coming through. And so they gathered and they realized it was going to cost each homeowner a significant amount of money. And so they kind of, on the opposite side of what you're saying, would use this tool to put that burden on the developer versus them. Because if there is no program for some type of loan or whatever grant towards these orphan roads, people living on, they're gonna have to absorb the cost, which can be astronomical.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I guess my argument is when you put it in the ordinance like this, it applies to every project. And you could have some properties where we connect to stub streets just because the requirement's there and we're adding that connection for public safety, but nobody from the new subdivision is really going to use it because it just doesn't make logistical sense from where traffic's going. So there's not really that burden. You're not really even putting the burden there, right? Like that does happen too. And honestly, that happens a lot more often than we think. We just had one over off Wade Nash where the people to the south were saying that subdivision, we were going to come through their neighborhood, but that didn't make any sense. Everybody was going to go north to Wade Nash, right? Like they weren't going to come through that subdivision. It just doesn't make logistical sense. So, but now we've got this in the ordinance where it has to be required. I think in your situation, the one that you're talking about, that's where we handle that, because 90% of the time you're going to have a rezoning or something that ties to it, and you work through that on a case-by-case basis, and that's something that, I mean, we try to enforce architectural conditions, even though we can't really enforce them, but we encourage them through the rezoning process. I don't see why working with adjacent development and creating that same kind of thing can't be worked out through that process, rather than it just being in the ordinance where everybody has to do it when maybe it doesn't make any sense.
And and to his point as well, it says like to upgrade, like what does that entail, right?
So these are NCDOT roads, so there's a
Okay,
punch list,
okay.
and DOT provides a punch list of what
to
needs
it.
to be done to make it acceptable.
So nice.
So these,
So they're saying-
just so I understand these orphan roads, you know, the state, kind of in my mind, it's either, you know, roads are either the state or the town, or if it's an HOA, maybe that they have some, but those are actually private. They'd be managed privately through the HOA. So really, the choices for these orphan road, the parents that are being neglectful are either the town or the state. Is that a fair statement?
Not-
Calling orphan roads.
Not really, because
yeah.
not really,
usually
because
you
it
can't
could be that the
just-
state doesn't know that it's even their road yet, because if the developer didn't go through the proper
Right.
channels to get the state to accept
Right,
it, then the
so
state
what
doesn't
we
know they
saw-
have it.
So, but yeah,
That
So
was
it's
the
not
one
like
we
the state-
saw was like the town, like if you go to, the GIS, it says one thing, but then, you go to that party, they may say, state-owned county DOT, you go to DOT, no, the town owns it, and it's kind of pointing fingers back and forth. And then it's, nobody wants to spend money to do anything on it. so
yeah,
it just kinda
but
gets
I guess
tossed
that's
around.
where I would always, again, they're orphan roads, there's parents that can adopt them,
Right.
but those two parents are the state or the town. And, is there, this is a method to make sure that they're brought up, that if I'm doing a development that uses these roads at all for, required to connect to them, that then I am, required to bring that up to state standards and go through the process of getting them on the state road. Maybe something that the previous developer that built that road in the first place should have done, and they did not. And this is the other thing, how come we can't hold those the previous developers accountable anymore? I mean, I know
I'd say
this.
that's more of a legal, but I see your point.
Yeah, I mean, this is.
Well, some of
this-
them are
so this is,
older.
this
The
is,
classic case was back '08, these developers were developing these state roads.
Right.
They had dedicated them, all of a sudden, they're not selling any more
Right.
lots. They go bankrupt, and the burden's left on what houses are left on the
Right.
street, and the developer's long gone, and there's no recourse because they're,
And a lot of them don't have active HOAs. They may have covenants and restrictions, but they don't have any for the HOA to say, hey, we're going to assess against all the residents to
Right.
do this. We'll take control of it. Most of them don't have that. So,
or,
there's no
Well,
way to.
and the other thing you had is when those developers went out of business, you would say, well, call their bonds. Well, what happened was bonding companies would be like, well, they just haven't put them in yet,
Right.
right? So then you can't call the bond.
right.
It's not as easy to just bring them up to state standards just because you're looking at it, right? Because the state, when you go to build a subdivision for the county and the state's gonna take over ownership, you gotta have proof roll tests and pavement cores and all that information. And chances are, somebody didn't go through the process of doing that the first go around, that information is probably not readily available. So it's a process to actually get the state to take on a road like that.
Right, but I guess that the point is that, it's the process, this is filling that gap. But, as you said, that's the risk that we take with it, that it's going to, it's, rather than orphaning the roads, we're gonna orphan some developments, right? So the trade-off is, do we leave these orphan roads, to kind of bear that burden, and then, but not giving those homeowners, the current existing homeowners, any options, or do we put it, as we do quite a few things, we burden the developer that's coming in and making the money and all that, and to basically, do those high-cost, high-capital improvements ahead of time so that our tax base doesn't have to pay for them. Because let's be frank, the reason that the town and the state don't take those is because they're significantly expensive projects, especially if we put out, we're trying to build sidewalks. We don't really want to be paving over roads that should already be,
Which would make sense for a bigger subdivision if it was being built, right? But if you're doing a 30-lot subdivision, like, you're not gonna pay the money for that. So that leaves the people on that stub street in the same condition they're at currently.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So
it's
I'm saying like a case by
kind
case
of
basis.
like, yeah.
If that development actually looks like they're gonna put a lot of traffic into that stub street, and some do and some don't, if it looks like that's the way that's running, then there should be some negotiation through that zoning process to make,
Yeah.
to mitigate their impacts, right? That burden, because it's not fair that the developer, necessarily gets to make the revenue off of it,
Yeah.
but do hardship on the adjacent neighborhoods. But the way this is everybody has to
Yeah.
do it. And
So-
I get that
And
that's
I
like
definitely like the
Just to
idea.
see, so you guys can see what we're talking about. Jason, if you can open up under town information and development in the layers list. Sorry, the top one, very top one. Yep. And then goes down, who maintains the street is 4 down. Open that one up, click on that. And then, yep, and open it up. There you go. And then streets maintained by others, if you can open that one up. Okay. Now, you guys can see the teal are what we have identified as maintenance responsibility undetermined. So those are potentially our orphan roads. So they are pretty limited. If you can scoot out just a little bit so we can see the whole town. So they are primarily, obviously, on the, maybe not that much, on the outskirts of town. They're generally pretty short. I mean, the good news is we do not have a significant orphan road problem like some of the other counties do. But this kind of gives you an idea of the potential we are talking about.
So so on this, zoom in a little bit more, there's what is that, Johnson Pond Road? So right there on that Johnson Pond, that Stub Street, Johnson Pond to the left of it right there, that teal one, that looks like it's actually connecting to maybe another subdivision right there? Yeah. Now that one right there, so that's technically a Stub Street right there, right?
That looks like a cul-de-sac, but if you zoomed up, there was
Yeah, it's a
two,
cul-de-sac.
there's a piece of property, it's like a Z-shaped at Hilltop Needmore that has two of
Okay,
these,
so that's-
of these roads
okay.
to it. So you
Yeah.
could potentially be having to, and those two, you would.
Yeah,
think
if you were
might
trying to
actually
develop
use
that
those
little
stub
zigzag,
streets.
yeah, if you
Yeah,
wanted-
you might actually use those. And so now what we've done is that property right there now became less valuable because of an ordinance change. Now, I'm not saying that those teal roads, there shouldn't be something done to remedy it, but the chances are that property has to come through some sort of zoning or something. And there should be something offered, especially if you're gonna run a bunch of lots through there. But even that one's not as bad, 'cause at least you look like there's frontage on Hilltop Needmore, so.
Yeah, but I feel like also, I mean, if you're developing that property and you're doing a developer agreement, you're probably going to be responsible for at least one of those orphan roads. I mean, I just have access to Johnson Pond and Hilltop Needmore anyway. I mean, chances are, whether it's in here or not, town's going to negotiate.
But that's what I'm
something
saying, like,
there.
but that would be the avenue. The way it is now, they would have to improve,
Right.
basically, or get it accepted in the state. And it could possibly be nothing, but essentially, both of those roads from their property all the way back out to Johnson Pond Road.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we also look at the burden, but we also, in this particular instance, there's a benefit to both of these subdivisions to connections to those stub streets. Now, they just got to get up to Hilltop Needmore Road without having to go on Johnson Pond Road. So there's
Yeah.
also a trade-off
But
there.
from our current experience, have we been able to negotiate having these orphan roads paved by current developers?
We
that
just
have this?
did one.
And you were able to negotiated in, okay.
Yeah, it generally requires density.
But I feel like, to Andy, your point,
I know there's been several that we have not been able to though, right? I mean, or either that or we didn't attempt to.
We didn't attempt to, yeah. This,
I guess,
there's a recent one that,
yeah, you don't
that it
ask,
came
that
up.
nobody's gonna offer, right?
Yeah.
Andy, to your point, like, if you're developing that and you've got, I mean, whether the existing subdivision is going to take it up to Hilltop Needmore or that potential subdivision is going to take it to Johnson Pond, I mean, if those roads aren't, if they're older or whatever, they're going to get worn down really fast. And I mean, it's going to be, is it the new subdivision's fault that it caused them to wear down? Is it the existing subdivision going up? I mean, you're never going to have that lower subdivision all agreeing to cover the cost of that. And I feel like it almost needs to be at that point where you have a developer not putting it on the homeowner down the road, whether it's 5 or 10 years from now, new subdivision, old subdivision, having to bear that cost. I mean,
Well, long
That's a
term,
tough sell, though. It's a
Yeah.
real tough sell.
long term, all these
It's a lot of
teal
road.
segments need to be given over to the town, I mean, long term, not today, maybe not even when,
The
but
town or NCDOT.
the town or NCD, I mean, one or the other. They have to be turned over. So I don't know, maybe we need to,
Yeah.
ask the commissioners to use some imagination or something
Right.
on this.
So I just get worried, like what happens, you put the subdivision there, nobody worries about those orphan roads 10 years from now. The roads are in disrepair, fire, and police
Right.
can't get through there. Whose responsibility is it then?
But
They're condemned roads
if no development goes in there, they're currently still gonna get worn down no matter what, and they're still not gonna be
yeah,
taken
but
care
not
of
to
by
the same
the
Yeah,
speed.
they're-
If you've
yeah.
got,
currently. So
if
it's
you've
like,
got 50 more houses going through there and
It's
using
ju-
those
you're
every
gonna-
day.
They're still gonna have a problem, it's just the development
Yeah.
around them. And even, for some of these, especially if there is, depending on how they're being accessed, that they might be getting more worn down now than they were planned originally,
Right.
because there's just there's
And
more
the very
traffic around them, right?
Well, and
At
here's
the very front, I've seen it in neighborhoods, I've lived in neighborhoods this way, where, you have a subdivision like this, that very back of the subdivision, those roads don't get used as much. Only, 5% of the neighborhood is using that, like, back of the road. But then the front of the neighborhood, where everybody's using, 100%
Yeah.
of residents using it, gets worn down faster. It's a little easier sell for an HOA to say, hey, we're gonna repave the first little bit. We're gonna, if it's dirt road, we're gonna drag the first little bit instead of the whole thing. But then if you make it a connection through where people are going both ways, you get 100% of traffic going both ways. It's gonna.
No, I
blow up
mean,
fast.
100% agree with everything that's being said. I'm just to Andy's point, it's gonna be hard to sell that lot to a developer saying he's gonna have to take care of connecting, and then both of those roads coming off of there that he has nothing to do with those developments, and now he has to improve them because the people that were there did not keep up with him, right? Or it just stays where it's at right now, and they just still don't get improved. So that's kind of like the caveat to.
Well, and also
dealing
keep in
with
mind,
that.
the way this is written is not written to repave the road, right?
It's
Because
written to upgrade.
it's
Yeah.
to upgrade it to NCDOT standards, which
Yeah.
may mean a lot more than repaving. You don't know
Than
what the
just paving,
subgrade
yeah.
looks like. You don't know what was done. I think you're more apt to get developers to agree to go in there and put another inch of asphalt on a roadway from point A to point B with a
know it.
one-year warranty on it and know what their defined scope is than to say, I got to bring it up to NCDOT standards, and nobody has X-ray vision to see what's in the ground and see how it was built,
Yeah.
right? So I feel like you're almost more apt to get what you want, which is ultimately to not put an undue stress on subdivision roads that were already there from a developer if they have a defined scope. This is if you're a developer and you read this and this is where if you're in that, just use that particular property, that becomes a humongous risk item. Versus if it says, hey, basically you're going to be responsible for having to go in there and work with the adjacent property owners or the adjacent subdivision to come up with a solution and assess the pavement. Maybe you have to add an inch of asphalt. Maybe you have to widen it from 18 feet to 20 feet. I don't know, whatever that scope is, you have a defined scope, and that becomes a zoning condition or through a developer's agreement. Somebody can absorb that because it's a known risk. You can take that into effect. You know what's going on there.
'Cause they
To
can
say it's got to be
compare.
brought into NCDOT standards and you have no idea what has been submitted on that when it was done, it's just you're just going to be chasing your tail for a while. So that's going to
As
become
part
a
of your due
risk.
diligence, you could get the DOT to go out and do a punch list. I mean,
You can, but even them, they can't see in the ground either. So part of that's going to be coring into the road and doing all those kind of testing. And then what happens when you find something you don't want to see? I feel like that just for me and just the way I looked at it and the way I read it, it just felt like that needed. That was not something I was supportive of. I like the idea behind it. I understand the process and why it's there. I just don't know that that's the right mechanism for me, I guess is where I'm sitting at.
Andy, if I can ask, what is the main reason why you're not supportive of it?
I think it's
Costs
just
that
too-
would be due on the developer, right?
And it's not cost due on the developers. I do think development should have the burden of not doing damage to neighboring subdivisions. But I don't think as a blanket statement it works. And I think that it's unfair that the majority of the properties that we're going to run into this situation on are properties that we brought in, we invited into our ETJ, and now we're telling the developers, hey, we kind of brought in all these properties and we brought in all these streets, but we're going to need you to fix those. On top of, now I'm going to need you to widen the road and I'm going to need you to extend the sewer. And so what we're really doing is not really, oh, poor developer. It's, oh, what happens to the prices of all the houses? Because all this, it doesn't matter what you make the developer do. It's ultimately going to come down to whatever the price of the house is. That's eventually who's going to pay for it. So it's not like the developer's not going to make any extra money. It's just going to be a task list for them. It's not like poor developer. It's more like, man, we keep talking about these house prices and it keeps going up and up and up. And that right there, when you start adding risk and cost to projects, that doesn't help us get in the right direction from what I'm seeing.
Okay.
That's just,
No,
yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
I love the idea. I love
Yeah.
the idea. It's just the
Yeah.
language that I think is a little bit torn off.
We do need to do something about the orphan roads. I think this kind
I
of
agree.
lays the gauntlet down and
Yeah.
kind of like
Seeing this
that.
map is.
Yeah, I mean, it does, and I like having
is a
something that
problem.
holds
See
them
if we can solve it.
accountable. I just don't know that it works in every situation throughout town. And it's almost like when we used to, do, is it a text amendment change or is it a special use permit? We used to guide people in those directions, because if it was beneficial to everybody, then we did a text amendment. If it was only for one particular person, we're like, you need to go the special permit route. This almost to me feels like a special permit kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like a case by case. Again, that's just me. I don't want to influence the board. That's just the way I read it. And
Right.
from my experience in working in subdivisions and working in neighborhoods and trying to identify risks and what works, this one was a big red flag for me.
Andy, when you say it would work on a case-by-case basis, could you give an example of how that might work?
Sure. I mean, like this property we're looking at right now. I mean, what is it zoned right now? Just out of curiosity.
Can we
I'm
turn
sure
the
it's
zoning
RA.
on?
I'm sure it's RA, right? Because I mean, I'm sure it got brought in with the ETJ, so it just got probably blanketed RA. Well, but I bet it's land use planned either mixed density or single family neighborhood, right? So somebody's going to try to rezone it to something to get density out of it. Like that, we all know that, right? So when somebody comes in to rezone it to something dense, well, as part of your density and you're doing your TIA, this track's large enough to where it's going to probably trigger a TIA. You're going to have some generations on where those trips are going to go, and you're going to have an idea of what impact you're putting on those two stub streets, some sort of idea. Then that's the point in which you come in, and like I said, we have rezoning conditions, and we try to implement things that, one, add quality and value to the town, and two, that don't burden our neighbors, and we try to be good stewards to our neighbors that are already here. And to me, improving a subdivision street on a stub street that you're tying to with a lot of density is part of your responsibility as being a good steward to that neighborhood.
So if you're doing low density, you shouldn't have to improve the orphan road, but
I
if
think
you're doing
you
high
should.
density, you should, is what you're saying.
I think if you want to get those things, in order to get them both, you kind of have to have some trade-off. Like in order to add additional cost to things and keep the prices where they are, you're going to have to give up on some density. Or if you're low density, you're not having as much an impact on those roads, then it's still not a burden. We're not adding that burden to that neighborhood. So that's why I say it's case by case. It just kind of depends on how you look at it. I mean, and if you're going to take something and get it rezoned, then you're going to have some due diligence to go in there and do those things. But right now, the carte blanche statement is you got to go in there and go talk to the state and have all that done. I don't know how long that street is, but that one looks pretty long. I mean, it's probably what, I don't know, 2/3 of them or a third of a mile. That's a pretty long way to go in there. And again, you're talking about adding cost to a development that is of no benefit, really, right? So that is a cost that will get straight to the houses.
Basically, if you're developing that, the roads you put in probably are less than fixing these two roads. I mean, you're gonna put in some internal roads,
Correct.
but
But at least with the internal roads, you're basically
Right,
adding,
you've
you're
got-
putting road in there to get your
To the
revenue, right? Or to
Right.
develop something. Here, you're just adding.
and you're doing it new, so making it to NCDOT standards is probably a lot more straightforward than trying to upgrade something.
Right, and I guess the thing about it is if you're going through that rezoning process and you're using that process to get there, whoever's trying to develop that property will have the time to go through DOT and be able to quantify what that looks like. Will quantify what that improvement means. And that does add value to the town, adds value to the subdivision, and it is beneficial to that development. I mean, those two substreets are golden for that subdivision because it really connects that whole corner, so it's beneficial for everybody. But that's just that one particular one. We could go to another one and it may not work. But if we just do the one statement in here, it doesn't matter whether it works or doesn't work, they still got to do it. And that's the part, I guess, where I'm like, man, this just feels like maybe the rezoning, that process where we have conditions is something we work through. And here's the thing, if somebody wanted to come in here and put high density in there, but didn't want to do any of those improvements, maybe that's not the right development, that's not the rezoning for that property.
If somebody were, like, say it was taken out of the amendment and it was part of y'all's normal process, somebody's doing, they're applying, they're doing a traffic study to see what the flow of traffic, all that. If it's attached to an orphan road, I mean, is it feasible, and Andy, you may know better than I would, is it feasible to say, hey, if it's attached to an orphan road, part of your traffic study or part of your planning and stuff needs to be, what is the condition of this orphan road? What is that punch list that NCDOT would require if we were, and then the town can say, well, this is what's required. This is kind of your cost benefit analysis of we're going to make you do it or we're going to make you not do it, or we'll make you do one of the roads to have ingress and egress, but not both of those streets. I mean, I don't know if that's still very burdensome on the developer, but I feel like you would almost have to have something like that if it's kind of in the discretion of the town, whether they're requiring it. Y'all are going to need that information to be able to put it into a land development agreement at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could scope things like that out in the TIA scoping when you
Right.
get to that point. The problem we would have is we don't have that required at
Yeah.
rezoning level, but I don't see why we couldn't require
Right.
assessment of existing roadways as part of the rezoning if that's, I mean,
Yeah.
if that's the
My-
way you want to do it, you know,
My only thing is I see your point to the burden. It makes me nervous if like a public policy standpoint from the town is to say we want all of our roads to be in the best condition for traffic, for safety, for, just general happiness of the public. And at what other point in, the scope of people's daily lives and development are we going to have the opportunity to fix these roads? I mean, I see it all the time with people with orphan roads, and the neighborhoods get together, but then years go by because they don't know the next step, or they get into the town versus Department of Transportation figuring out who needs to do what and what has to get there. It's just, if our goal as an entity is to have good roads, this to me is just our one at bat to get that. But I also get the other side of the public policy of wanting to have development, wanting to have, quality development, not putting burden on there. So I just don't know what the middle ground is, whether it is something the town wants to agree on to put in land development agreement.
right,
But
so I just want to be clear though, I don't feel sorry for the developers. I'm not like poor developer. I don't think the developer should get out without having to take care of this situation. I think they should absolutely be responsible for it. I don't mean to get that apart. I'm just saying that I think that that's not necessarily the best use as a carte blanche statement for everything. That's kind of, I guess, where I'm getting at. Like, it's not poor developer again, because like I said, the developer's going to take that cost and pass it along. I mean, like it's ultimately going to come down to who buys the houses. That's really where it's going to happen. And it's not fair to the people that live in those neighborhoods to have to deal with the ramifications for somebody else making a profit. I don't mean it to sound like that. I just think that there's got to be some way maybe to look at it individually rather than just one fell swoop. And to be honest with you, if somebody's going through to rezone this, and that is something that we look at, is that if there's some mechanism that requires an assessment, it's almost behooves them to do that during the rezoning process, because you may try to do a rezoning condition that limits your density because you think that's the best move. But if a few more lots got you to be able to pave this whole thing and that helped create the balance in there, you could kind of work that out through the rezoning situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I do think there's obviously a responsibility on the developer to not be a burden, but not at the point at which, if they're not actually impacting it, having to pay for it. It's almost like when we do a TIA and you produce 2% of the traffic to a certain intersection that's already operating at a bad level of service. Can we require that developer to go in there and fix the entire intersection? Well, no, if it's already a bad intersection and they're only contributing 2%, that doesn't really seem right, And we kind of look at those, we use the TIA mechanism to look at those on a case-by-case basis.
Is there a way that we could make this more discretionary? Because I like the idea of having it the idea of having something referred to, but is there a way to do it in the TTIA, I think is a good example of how we say you're just gonna have to, we're gonna do a study and you're gonna be responsible for, fixing whatever problems come out of the TTIA.
Yeah, I think they should be definitely on the hook for assessing it, and then at some point you have to decide what that looks like.
Right, but then we would have, again, it would give us the discretion to say, there is no traffic generated and, or not enough for, to raise to the level of having to fix these roads versus, and that's where I kind of wanted to understand the staff's level of discretion on this. Is it like, the way it's written now, it's like there's no negotiation, there's no this, you will do this and, suck it up. But is there, but.
Yeah, no, trying to make it, what
Right.
we've tried to do is make it more objective than subjective as far as not being able to
Right, and
pick
it
what
is very
developer you
objective.
decide to do
You're
it.
gonna- You're gonna do it if it's an order.
So, right.
It's objective, and I'm kind of fine with that. Although, is there a way to back it off to some, make it objectively you're required to, but, that there might be some, a mechanism that we put in at the staff level that could give you some discretion to be able to do that. I mean, because you have the opposite right now. You don't have to do anything. You have the discretion to kind of push them on this issue when it makes sense. So but I don't know that we can flip it around and do it the other way where we have it written in there, but then there's, we can back off on that requirement if, these other things make sense.
Is it already, if somebody's already doing a development to an orphan road, are they required to do any, study now as far
So
as?
it all depends on
Yeah.
how big the development is, whether TI is required. I mean,
Right.
one of the issues, Andy had mentioned, repaving or fixing it up. And while, yes, that solves today's problem, in the end, you can't do half an adoption, right? I mean,
Right.
it's either adopted or it's not. It's maintained long range. So, I mean,
Right.
the ultimate goal here for everyone, for the county, the state, and the town, was to have public roads publicly maintained.
Right.
And unfortunately, nobody wants to take them for maintenance until, again, like you mentioned, we're starting at the top, right?
Right.
They're in pristine condition.
What I will say is, with Andy's questions and and concerns, and it seems like everybody else has similar concerns and questions as it pertains to density. Again, if you have a larger, from what I'm gathering, if you have a larger developer that's building 200 homes, it may not be so much of an impact versus a developer that is building, 40 homes or 75 homes, something to that degree. Is that what we can all agree on, that's?
What's the trigger for a TIA right now? Is there,
About 100 lots.
Generally around 100, yeah.
I mean, we already have a TTI, make the same trigger. If it triggers a TIA, then it triggers this requirement. I mean, it's something like that. I
That's
mean,
no, but something to think about. That's
Yeah, something
that's a
similar
good
to that.
point.
That's a good
What-
idea.
Yeah.
What I would say is, for this specific item in the text amendment, that we take this out and take a look at it a little bit further, and then bring it back in due time.
Yeah, I would think that's it.
That would be stat.
I would-
I think it's worth this, and it's also obviously worth discussing. They're also, again, it's a long-term problem. We aren't really fixing it by putting it in here. We still have the problem of roads that they will never be touched by developers.
But the
on
means
each
to
side.
the end could be different, right?
Right, but, so we need to, somebody needs to be, and unfortunately, and most of these, are all of these in the ETJ, or are most of these in the ETJ? That's like
Most.
Most.
There-
So,
there could
I
be
mean,
a
as the
few that
town,
just-
I mean, obviously, it's okay to kind of fix somebody's road that's actually paying taxes to the town. Obviously, the town itself has no specific value in fixing ETJ orphan roads. That would be at the county, and the county doesn't care. And so it's at the state level, so.
Yeah, I can appreciate you guys trying to make it objective, but the honest truth is the LDO is pretty much subjective all the way through. Just because there's no more, like, when you write these documents, and we always say it all the time, they're living, breathing documents. The reason you guys have to keep doing these is because we keep running into these weird situations, just because it's just where we're at now. And I think that's just part of the process. I mean, I appreciate the fact of making it objective. It makes it a lot easier when you're reading it, but I tell people all the time, it's not like, the ordinances are not like building codes. Building codes are like black and white. It's like, this is this. There's like this much black and white in the ordinance and about this much gray. And it's just how we work through it.
Sure, and if the planning board, again, is good with it, we'll extract that from there, work on it further, and then just.
I think we should consider that in our motion too.
Yeah, you're right, correct.
Thank you.
Can I bring it back to a less involved
All right.
subject?
To be fair, I let everybody else go first.
Beehives.
Yeah. Food trucks. So just a question about how it is now and how it's changing, talking about hours of operation. So under the existing ordinance now, if a food truck, say, my business wants to have a food truck, existing now, I don't have to be open to have it there, but we're kind of moving it towards.
No, right now you have to be open. That's not changing.
Okay. I just know of like a food truck in town that typically is open when the business isn't necessarily open, I would assume. But I see the benefit to a business as well, especially if it's a very visible public business. They may not be getting foot traffic at that point, but it still benefits the business to have, in certain scenarios. But I get that we're just kind of clarifying it to an existing.
Yeah. That is the current standard. That's not
Okay.
changing, so.
Perfect. Sorry, I just wanted to get us back on the larger.
I have a couple more questions, but they're not nearly as, hopefully, as confrontational as that one was. More so, it was just a question that said, it looked like in here on street trees that we're going back to putting street trees between the curb and the sidewalk. Is that what we're doing? Mm-hmm. Is there? And I'm just curious as to what the rationale behind this. I remember when we took it out, and we took it out because we were getting problems with curbs and sidewalks getting torn up and different things, and I didn't know if there was a reason why it was going back.
Right,
Personally, I don't have
so
an opinion one way or the other.
We're working with engineering. There's a couple things, so look out for the new specifications that will be fresh off the presses for the November 4th town board meeting. The sections are, we're going to make that planting strip a little bit wider to accommodate.
Okay.
We are also, several neighbors have some really good standards for root barriers that we feel like have been working. So we're going to put in some root barriers to protect those sidewalks and the streets. And it really does give you the street tree feel when you have those street trees
Sure.
right against the curb. So it's an aesthetic we'd like to get back into. It also opens up the area outside the sidewalk for a utility easement. Right now, we have with fiber and gas and all the other telephone and all the other things coming through, those areas are really jammed packed. So we would also like to kind of funnel it and say trees are going here, everything else can go here, because right now there's a lot of conflicts going on when the various different fiber and all the private contractors come in to put in these dry utilities. So it kind of opens up a bigger window for them.
Yeah, they do like to tear up a subdivision street.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I was just curious on that one, like I was just.
So, but again, they will be.
I remember when we took it out, we moved it, now we're moving it back, and I was just curious why we're moving it back. But yeah, I think it does look better, I think, a little bit whenever it's in there like that.
I know the town board is going to get presented the engineering specs, the specs. Anyway, we could get like just a,
We can send them to you for sure.
well, I was thinking maybe just a short presentation on them,
Sure.
either before or after the,
And is that gonna be like a subdivision requirement? Or just,
Yeah, our local roads are changing.
okay.
So it'll be the local residential roads.
Okay.
We'll now have, instead of, right now, what we have is the utilities are running down that
Yeah.
green strip, right?
Yeah.
And then the street trees are actually outside the right-of-way in a street tree, a private street tree easement.
Yeah.
This is putting the street trees back into the
Back
right-of-way.
between the curb and the sidewalk,
Mhm.
okay. And currently, the subdivisions that don't have them, will they be able to put those back in? Like, will they be able to plant trees in those?
This will be new
after
moving
that?
forward.
Okay. Got it.
So what do you guys do to the maintenance on those now? Does that now fall into the town if they need pruning or anything like that?
Nope, you are, as the resident, are responsible for mowing the grass and taking care of your tree. There will be documents, the HOA covenants will also, again, just like we do with the private street tree easements, the HOA is ultimately responsible for those street trees. So if a resident isn't taking care of it, either the HOA can do it or the HOA can require the resident to take care of those trees.
Super. And the only other question I had was on the buffer table. And I think this is gonna be one of those things that we're just gonna have to work through and see how it figures out. I was trying to wrap my head around it, like, I like the new buffer. I think it's good. I do. I like it. I'm just curious as to why the same buffer is used in type 2, 3, and 4. If why it didn't step down a little bit, because in the way I read this is like if you do a subdivision, a low density subdivision of 14,000, 15,000 square feet, you may have lots that range from 15 to 19. You have the same buffer as a daycare.
Yes.
And so I was trying to figure out why it didn't step down, if there was a reason for that, or just kind of trying to play with it and maybe see what, some of these things we put in there and then they look good on paper and then you work through it and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't really.
Yeah,
doesn't
and
really
this
work
is
out.
definitely one of those cases.
Okay.
This is something that was reflective, a couple of amendments ago. We installed, so one of the things that we feel are important to protect is kind of our low-density county subdivisions, our residents who have been here for a significant amount of time. And when, development comes up right next to them, it can change their views, their perception, their lifestyle, right? And so we recently had put in an amendment that required 50 feet of undisturbed buffer or 75 feet of planted buffer adjacent to these large parcels. There was some kind of discrepancy and confusion in the language on whether that was just residential parcels or agricultural parcels. One of the problems is if you have a development going in, you are developing a farm, right? And there's another farm next door, and you have to put a significant buffer next to that farm next door. But when that farm develops, they don't have to do any buffer, that there was some kind of some inconsistencies there. So we really determined that 50-foot undisturbed buffer, 75-foot planted buffer was for PUDs and form-based development, I believe. And it was a little bit complicated. It had to do with the number of lots on that side of the property. We ran into some issues where people were proposing an undisturbed buffer, but then not all of it was existing woods. So what do you do in those areas where it's a lapse? We had one situation where that undisturbed was actually an undisturbed concrete driveway, which really didn't meet the goals at all, right? And so instead of having this separate standard that only applied to certain developments and honestly, we learned became complicated, we have these wonderful perimeter buffer standards as is. And so if we just go in and kind of beef up the perimeter buffer standards and use a tool that we already have that really works, and kind of shuffle back down those types, the landscape types, prioritizing that these large lots are really our number one priority to protect using these perimeter buffers, protect from really everything. I mean,
I got you.
small lots, townhomes, commercial.
Everything.
Everything is what we designed. So we are taking out those other more complicated extra versions and just working everything into the landscape buffers that we currently have.
It's a good buffer. I like it. It was good. I liked it. There was a lot of
sure you do.
evergreens, and it was good. I thought it was a good amendment. I just was curious as to why there was one. Maybe makes it easier. So, all right, I'm all out of questions now. Sorry.
Good questions, very
Yeah.
good.
I wrote down the orphan road statue if you want me to make the motion. Wrote down the number.
If nobody else has any questions, comments, or concerns, I'm certainly willing to entertain a motion for sure.
All right, I'll move to recommend approval of CTA 2024-03 amendment number 28, except for section 9-1/1602, section A3, an amendment to the Town Code of Ordinance, Part 9 Land Development Ordinance as presented and recommended by staff. The text amendment improves upon the Land Development Ordinance and is reasonable and in the best interest of the public for the reasons identified by staff.
Got a motion
Second.
Thank you.
and a second. Any further discussion before we vote? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Sorry for that one. Okay, at least now we're done with public hearings. Other business, item 5A, presentation update to the 2040 Comprehensive Transportation Plan. The purpose of this agenda item is to receive information regarding the update of the 2040 Comprehensive Transportation Plan. Further information provided by staff.
So I know that we presented the CTP to you before the public comment was over, and some of you were frustrated by that. So we will do this similar thing. We can bring the new cross sections and some of the specs, the highlights of that, to potentially to the November planning board meeting. But I'm going to just kind of give you a 10,000-foot update. These are the other thing we're going to present here is also some of the changes, so you guys can really visualize what's changed between. So we had engagement phases 1 and 2. The second phase really focused on two more steering committee meetings, a pop-up event at the Growers Market, a public workshop, and a month-long opportunity to view and offer feedback on the draft. In total, over 1,700 people have visited the town's website since we began this update. We did only get 7 actual written responses on the draft. And most of them were, they were commenting on pedestrian in most cases.
Saw a couple Stub Street comments too.
So this map shows some of our recently completed projects, including NC 540, the completion of the Judd Parkway Loop, U5751. So these are projects that are coming, funded, programmed. You can see that several intersection projects are either funded or under right-of-way acquisition that will serve to improve overall circulation. So this is kind of from the coming out of the 2035 plan. So this map represents proposed improvements to our existing roads. Now, in many cases, these are also consistent with what was previously reflected on the 2035 CTP. I'll have another future map coming up that's going to show you what we're changing between the 2035 and 2040. But on this one, just to highlight it, green roads represent corridors that in the future will have a median. Orange roads incorporate a level of modernization that can include rehabilitating, restriping roads, lane reconfiguration, shoulder additions, and curb and gutter enhancements. And this is obviously something we will bring to you when we actually have the cross-sections finished. But some of our priorities with this cross-section update were adapt to rapid growth, accommodate a broader vision for multimodal transportation and micromobility options, align the town's complete streets approach with broadly used national standards by integrating NCDOT and MUTCD standards,
Transition to a broader system of complete streets by expanding the use of collector roads for origin to destination continuity, enable more connectivity within and through new developments at the developer's cost instead of the public costs. Rectify some disparities between the LDO, the engineering specs, and the CTP, and to integrate some traffic calming considerations into our local roads. Just so you guys know, the traffic calming policy that originally was presented to you guys has been pulled out. We are going to explore that further and bring it at a future date. But some of these sections do include some tools that will calm traffic just by design. So this is our cross-section update. This map shows our new cross-section palette. The updated cross-sections improve uniformity of the cross-section elements. They modernize the elements to meet the current standards. They coordinate with some of our neighboring municipalities to make sure transitions between our towns maintain the circulation goals, and it all makes sense. So when we bring the cross-sections to you, I can show you an example. They are kind of easy. These cross-sections, these images will actually be in the CTP, real basic general ones, and they will refer to the specs for the details because we have built in, we have these real cool 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 options depending. So we kind of have one road section that has a lot of different options that you can select and pick from depending on the situation. So where it used to be form-based roads were the only ones really that allowed on-street parking, we've seen a lot more on-street parking with rear alley lanes and townhomes and all in our PUD standards. So now we have this really awesome palette to choose from that you can put. This is what it looks like if you put parking on one side. This is what it looks like if you put parking on the other side. This is if it's commercial and you put a wider sidewalk in, so you have a more commercial, more urban feeling. So there's a lot of really cool options that each road section is going to be able to provide, and we could kind of narrow it down to where they're appropriate. So we are very excited about these. So these are changes since the 2035 CTP. So you can see here the red lines show added capacity is applicable only to NC 55 north of Judd Parkway as a result of the U5751 project. The orange lines reflect an altered alignment. These alignment shifts were recommended in order to align with proposed developments, reduce environmental and historical impacts, and reduce significant roadway impacts to individual small parcels. The green lines identify existing roads that have now been assigned a collector road classification, so in the future they can serve a higher volume in anticipation of increasing traffic. Purple lines show new roads being planned by others. So this is your U5751, the alignment of 55, and the US 401 bypass. Blue lines reflect new collector streets. These new roads are connections made in response to a previous collector being removed. So some of those that, due to environmental or other reasons, we took one off, these might be the ones that we pivoted to. And then the dark gray lines reflect collectors that were removed. Some of these have been constructed. Some have been identified as infeasible due to environmental challenges. And as a result of the town increasing our cross-access and stub requirements, some of these connections previously were identified to be collectors, but we feel that they can serve adequately as roadway connections from subdivision to subdivision and don't necessarily need to serve as a collector. This is our 2035 CTP. The purple is the proposed side path. You can see on here that we had pretty extensive side path. We have a few existing side paths, a few existing greenways, but the big difference, if I flip it to the next one, this is the proposed. So again, we did a deep down dive into our pedestrian, what our neighbors have and those connecting roads, and also what sidewalks we have already built, which I'll show you in a minute. And so there were some roads that further out of our core that we determined that sidewalks were actually a good solution and they didn't necessarily need to be side paths because we would still get those connections. And then if I go to the next one here, you will see this is actually our proposed and existing sidewalk networks. And these are really just on our collectors. Obviously, there's significant more sidewalks in our developments. Another thing that this CTP is doing is we are requiring sidewalks on two sides of all roads.
Yeah, that was the question I actually had because we have a lot of sidewalks only on one side of the road. And
Yep.
And sometimes you don't even have a good crosswalk to be able to go from one side to the other. So fixing that's a very, very good. Thank you.
Exactly, so, and also since the 2035 plan, 25 projects have been completed or funded by the town and/or NCDOT since implementation of the 2035. So our website is always a good reference, but we've gotten a lot done, which is really exciting. So, I mean, really, in summary, the 2040 CTP validated many of the assumptions previously made with the 2035 CTP, since many of the transportation projects identified in the 2035 CTP have either been constructed or are upcoming committed projects. Staff confirmed that the 2035 CTP directives are working to serve our growing community and increasing traffic demands. In the last 10 years, the town board has approved over $100 million of transportation projects. The changes proposed in the 2040 CTP will continue the momentum of the previous plan while accommodating even more growth and integrating modernization and more multimodal options. So we're excited about it.
That looks good.
Yeah, it looks really good.
Just when you have the different options with different cross sections, are they all in the same right of way, or they have different right of ways? And
No, they're all in the same right-of-ways.
all in the same right of way.
Mhm.
Good, it's awesome.
They sure are.
Holly Springs just did some genius thing where they did that, and then all the right of ways change and depends on if you're urban or suburban, and
Their map is pretty complicated.
I don't know how you figure it out. It's like
No,
a Rubik's cube.
This looks really exciting. It is very logical, and so the beauty is, we did not change any of the right-of-way widths from the 2035. We are doing all this modernization in those existing right-of-way widths.
That's awesome.
That's good, yeah.
Good.
All right, Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. So at this time, I will request a motion to recuse Planning Board Member Andy Petty from Agenda Item 5B, Preliminary Subdivision Plat, Holland South Estate Subdivision.
Move that we recuse Andy from this item.
Second.
All right, now that we have a motion and a second, do we have to make a vote on this?
Yes.
All in favor for recusing Andy, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? All right, Andy, we'll see you later.
Probably better off for you that way and get out of here on time.
All right. So the purpose of this agenda item is to consider a preliminary subdivision plat submitted by Curry Engineering for the Holland South Estate subdivision located at 1605 Holland Road. Further information will be provided by staff.
Good evening, Miss Alternate Chair and other members of the board. Being a solid Baptist and realizing I'm the last one standing between you and supper, I will try to keep this quick. The project we bring before you tonight is Holland South Estates. Also would like to enter the agenda abstract and all supporting documents into the official record of the town. So Holland South Estates subdivision is the current property is 25.43 acres that is currently zoned residential agriculture. The proposed subdivision is proposing 24 residential lots with an average lot size of 28,960 square feet. The plan also proposes 7.5 acres of open space. A couple of the highlights on this one is it is on Holland Road. Public water and sewer are currently not available, but water will be extended by the developer down Holland Road and along the entire frontage. And because this is a low density subdivision, it will be served by private septic systems. And also another important caveat for this one we'd like to point out is that with a grand total of 24 lots and being adjacent to developed parcels, Holland South Estates qualifies as an infill subdivision per section 9-1608 of the LDO, and as such is only required to dedicate the right of way per the CTP, but is not required to construct the frontage improvements along Holland Road. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, love the cemetery in the middle of it.
I believe that was an existing condition, so.
Not a new business?
There's no orphan roads attached to this one. Is that what Andy's?
That looks good.
All right, at this time, I'll ask if any board members have any questions or comments other than the cemetery. If not, I will entertain a motion if there are no questions or comments.
Motion to recommend approval of the Holland South Estate subdivision plat SUBPR-2024-04 as presented and recommended.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Andy, I'll hand it back to you to
All right, I
close
get
this
to
out.
come back. All right, just in time for the administrative report. Item 6A, the purpose of this agenda item is to receive information on the disposition of the planning board's recommendations to the town board of commissioners since the September 17th, 2024 planning board meeting. Any questions? Anybody?
No, I just want to thank the staff for doing this all the time. I really do appreciate it. I mean, I don't know if everybody else appreciates it, but it's like, it's an extra thing I know you guys do, and I appreciate you keeping the planning board up to date on the commissioner's actions.
It is good to know whether we're aligned or not.
Yeah, it's important for us to do that, trust me.
All right, if nothing else. Barbara, it's your time to shine.
Motion to adjourn.
Got a motion?
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned.